Come to Jesus. Now your burden's lifted. Carry all away. Precious blood has washed away the stain.
You're listening to a message presented at New Market Christian Church. We're located at 300 South 3rd Street in New Market, Indiana. We meet for Sunday school at 9 o'clock and for worship at 10 o'clock each Sunday morning. If you do not have a church home, we'd love to invite you to join us here at New Market Christian Church. And now, a message by Dr. Gary Snowden.
When you walk, sometimes we fall. So fall on Jesus. Fall on
Last week. If you remember, last week's message title was Making the Main Thing the Main Thing. Remember that? And I asked you to do something last week, so with a show of hands, I'd like to know how many of you found a way to spend some time with your family this week. Okay, how many found time to spend some time with your friends this week? Now, most importantly of all, how many of you found some time to spend with God this week? Pretty good. I see lots of hands out there. That means that the message is hitting its mark, and we're making a difference. And that's what we want to do. This week's message, I hope it'll do the same thing. It will actually hit the mark. I title it, Things Are Not Always As They Seem. And boy, is that true. Friends, we need to be aware that things are not always as they seem. There are several texts in today's message. If you look inside your bulletin, they're all listed out for you. You'll find them there in the handout inside of the bulletin. Rather than read them all to you, you can look at them there. But I did want you to know that the focus text for this morning, so that you can open it up and hold it in readiness, is Mark chapter 12, verses 41 through 44. It's a very familiar passage of Scripture. It's talking about the widow's mite. Today's premise as we get started is that we shouldn't draw conclusions without all the facts. If you do, I got news for you. It can be really, really devastating. And the reality is, the story I read this week in preparation for the message, somebody drew some conclusions before he got all the facts. And boy, did he get himself in a mess. I read a story this week about a police officer. He worked in a really, really small town. And that's not a bad thing. You know, you pretty much know everyone for the most part, and things were going pretty well for him. But one day, he stopped a young man that he really didn't know, seemed to be from out of town. He was speeding down Main Street. Well, he pulled him over, and as soon as he got the young man to pull over and stop, he headed up to the car. And right away, that young man started pleading his case. It's like, officer, I can explain, officer. The officer snapped back, you just be quiet, son. He pulled him over for speeding. He didn't want to hear all of it. Please, sir, just let me explain. Well, the officer was working alone, and he didn't really want to be bothered with all of this young man's excuses. So he looked at him and said, son, I told you to hush up. But, sir, that does it. You keep going, son. I'm going to let you cool your heels in jail till the chief gets back. But officer, you don't understand. I told you to keep quiet, son. You know how officers can be a little snippy sometimes. But officer, you don't understand. That's it, son. You're going to jail. He hauled that young man off. He fingerprinted him and he threw him in the cell and just left him there for a couple of hours. A couple of hours later, he came back and looked in on the prisoner just to make sure everything was going all right. He looked at that young man and he says, lucky for you, the chief's at his daughter's wedding. He'll be in a really good mood when he gets back. He said, I wouldn't count on it, sir. You see, I'm the groom. Well, when you act before you get all the facts, it can make you make some really bad decisions, can't it? We need to be aware that things are not always as they seem. They're just not. Have you ever jumped to conclusions about something only to find out that you were really, really wrong. Ever done that? I have. I have, and I didn't care much for the results. I'm going to tell myself, I told you all before, I'm not perfect. I mess a lot of things up, and sometimes I make some big mistakes. I did a funeral once for one of the men in church where I was preaching. That wasn't a mistake. I do those a lot. But during that funeral, his daughter-in-law was there, and she really liked the way I did the funeral and the way that I did the life review when I met with the family and the whole background. And it just so happens that she worked with a really big hospice. And I mean, it was a big one. It covered like 2 states, and it was a huge hospice. And I was working as a hospice chaplain and preaching at a church up in Fort Recovery, Ohio. And I had to drive about an hour and 20 minutes to get to where I did the hospice chaplaincy. It worked out pretty well. My dad was down there. I'd preach on Sundays, and I'd work on Monday and Tuesday, get my sermon done, and then I'd run down, and I'd be a hospice chaplain for 3 days, and I'd come back and take a little bit of time to go call on people, and then I'd preach again. I was working constantly, 2 different jobs, and she told me that there was a position open at this really big hospice, and that she would be glad to vow for me that I did a really good job with her dad, and she thought that I would be a really good fit where she worked. Well, I thought about that, and I prayed about that for a little while. I talked it over with my wife, and it sounded like a really great move. I mean, this was a really big hospice. It was going to be a full-time chaplaincy position. I'd been doing chaplaincy as a hospice chaplain for some time, so I knew what the job entailed, and I knew I could do it. So I left 2 jobs that I loved. I loved preaching there in Fort Recovery, and I loved being the hospice chaplain at Henry County Hospital. I loved both of those jobs. I left both of them in order to be the hospice chaplain for State of the Heart Hospice over in Ohio. Left 2 jobs that I loved, and I walked in on that first day, and I knew right away I had made an awful mistake. Too late, I'd already quit my other 2 jobs, but I was there. I walked in that first day, and it was completely disorganized. The person in charge of human resources walked in with a couple of CDs. She says, "I'm really busy today. Could you set up this equipment, put these CDs in, and watch them?" And I started thinking to myself, this is rinky-dink, but I'll do her. So I put those CDs in, and I watched those CDs about washing your hands and washing your hands and washing your hands. Washing your hands, a lot about washing hands. And then after I finished watching all these washing your hand movies, and another person came in, and she handed me a notebook. And she said, "I'm really busy today. Could you read this notebook?" And I thought, I know how to read. I can do that. So I sat down and I read through this notebook. That sucker was like that thick. It talked about all kinds of things about washing your hands. Washing your hands. And that's the way it is. You work with people, you got to wash your hands a whole lot. I got done doing that, and then this lady comes back and she gives me a brief overview of the benefits. She told me my health insurance was going to cost twice as much as it had been costing. And I was only going to get this much coverage when I was getting this much coverage. And then she told me that for mileage, where I was getting this much, I was now going to get this much. And I got done with that day, and I went home, and I told my wife, I have made an awful mistake. I jumped to conclusions. I thought working at this really big hospice, being able to stay in the house where we lived, would be really neat. I left 2 jobs that I loved to become this hospice chaplain. And boy, I jumped into the fire. Well, the next thing they did is they sent me out with the retiring hospice chaplain. We went in to each patient, and he'd say, "My name is," and introduce himself. And then he would introduce me. And then he would get out a poem book. And you start at the first of the day, and he reads the same poem at each place you go. So you read the poem, and says a prayer, and we're gone. I've been a hospice chaplain for a long time. I never did something like that. I went in, I sat down, I talked with people, I got to know them, they got to know me. I'd sing them songs, I'd pray with them, I'd share stories with them. I couldn't figure out what in the world I got myself into. But that was the idea of hospice chaplaincy in this particular organization. He had been doing this for years, and I thought to myself, what a waste. What a waste. Finally, they gave me my list of patients. We had about 150, 160 patients normally. And out of that 100 and some patients, I had 60 of them that were assigned to me. In my territory was 100 miles north and south and 50 miles east and west. And then they told me I had to see all 60 of those patients 3 times a month. Suddenly I understood why you walked in, read a poem, said a prayer, and left. It's the only way you can get to them all. Well, I tried to spend a little bit more time with my patients. So I told them stories. I sang them songs and prayed with them. Spent a little bit of time with each one. I was really rushed that if you drive really fast, I didn't really do that. I'm not much of a fast driver, but if you keep moving, you could get to them, but it was a lot of work. I did that for a few weeks, and I got called into the office. They told me, we have music therapists that sing songs. You're not qualified to sing. I thought, good grief, I've been singing all my life. The music therapists have a bachelor's degree. I got 2 more than that. Come on, But she was the boss, so I had to stop singing. And then she said, by the way, you're spending way too much time with each patient. And I thought to myself, what have I done? It turned out they didn't really want someone to support folks. They wanted someone to show up face to face and pray and leave in order that they could get the number of visits they had to have to meet government regulations to get their money from the government. That's what they wanted, but that just wasn't me. I continued to try and spend as much time as I could with each patient, and I did something that really messed up my life. You ever done something that messed up your life? Made it miserable for you? I went and talked to my supervisor's supervisor. Whoo, doggies. That don't go well. I still got chills just thinking about it. I went in and talked to her and I said, ma'am, they told me that I couldn't sing, but when I sing, it's not therapy. I am preparing people to worship God. And I spend time with them because I'm preparing people to worship God. They can't go to church. I'm the only church that they get because they're locked up in their homes or in nursing homes. And I bring God to them. And we worship together. I don't sing as therapy. I sing to draw people closer to God in order that we can worship together and pray together. And you know what she said? That sounds like a good idea. Go ahead and do it. That's okay till the other supervisor finds out. And then they call you back into the office and your life gets real miserable real quick. And that went on for about 2 weeks, and guess what? Her supervisor gave me another supervisor, so now I'm on my, supervisor. And I spent a year there surviving. 1 miserable year, doing the best I could in a very difficult circumstance, having left 2 jobs that I love to take a job I hated. I thought bigger and closer would be better. I thought working 1 job close to home would be better than working 2 at a distance. But the fact is, I absolutely hated my new job. And what I learned is the conclusion I jumped to was wrong. You ever done that? You ever made a decision and wished afterwards, man, I sure wish I hadn't have done that. You jump to a conclusion and we get ourselves into a real mess. I guess what I need you to do is just think about it for a moment. Think about that. Have you ever jumped to a conclusion that got you into a pickle? You ever done that? Look at all the heads. Looks like you got a bobbleheads out there. They're all doing like this. I guess that's a bigger problem than I realized. We almost all, it seems, have jumped to conclusions that have got us in a pickle from time to time. And I'm guessing that the answer probably for everyone, if you think about it long enough, is yes. You can find something that you've done you wish you hadn't have done. Because the fact is, things are not always as they seem. They're just not. In today's focus text, Jesus teaches his disciples to look beyond the first impressions so that they can discover the real truth. You'll probably recognize this story. It's the story of the widow's mite there in Mark chapter 12. We're going to begin there with verse 21, and what we're going to discover in that verse when we read it is the amount of one's gift doesn't win approval. Now, if you look in your little handout, it's in there too. The amount of one's gift doesn't win approval. In fact, it can be huge and still not win approval. Let's read the verse there in Mark chapter 12, verse 41. It says, "And he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the offering box." And get this, many rich people put in large sums. See that there? Many rich people put in large sums. Not only did these rich people put in large sums of cash, but they made sure their gifts were well announced. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 2, we're told that some of those hypocritical religious people would sound trumpets. Hey, I like that trumpet sound. They sound trumpets before they would give their money so everybody would look at them and know that they were giving. According to the Jewish Mishnah, the temple had a metal cone-shaped thing on top of their offering boxes. So you could throw your money in, let it go, clank, 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 and then down into the wooden box, making lots of noise so that whenever you gave, you throw your money in and everybody would know that you had given. People would come in, throw their coins in order that they could be glorified for what they'd done. Their giving was done for show. They wanted folks to see them give. Their goal, you see, was self-glorification. But they weren't fooling Jesus at all. Sure, he saw them put the money in. He heard the trumpets and he heard the clanging. But he was not impressed. He wasn't impressed by their giving at all. You see, Jesus knew what they had kept for themselves. Interesting, huh? Jesus knew what they had kept for themselves. Friend, we need to be aware that things are not always as they seem. Reminds me of a church where Kim and I served once. How does that remind you of church? Looks more like a steak dinner to me. Well, that's what it reminded me of. A family took us out to eat at a very expensive, you ever been to one of those expensive places? A really expensive steakhouse for supper. And they brought out a huge steak like the size of our table. Might be a little bit of exaggeration, but you can see from the picture, they got these huge steaks. They also gave us a quarter beef to put into our freezer. That steak was about as big as the table. Well, you just took your knife and you cut off all the steak you wanted. And when you got done with the meal, you divided it up and you all took home steak because it was huge. And I tell you what, it was a fabulous night of dining. And those steaks they gave us to put in our freezer, they were marvelous, tender, juicy, scrumptious. Ooh, makes me hungry just thinking about it. They were good steaks. But sometime later, one of their friends who was a church deacon did a couple of very stupid things. He covered up for a kid who brought drugs to youth meeting. That's never good. Bring drugs to youth meeting, bad thing. Don't do that. Don't do that. And if someone does do it, we got to deal with it because it can't just keep going on. He covered up for a kid that brought drugs to a youth meeting. And then a little later, the same deacon covered up for an affair that had taken place between another deacon's wife and one of the young men in the youth group. And that young man came to youth group and he was bragging about his exploits with the other deacon's wife to all the young people in the youth group. And rather than bringing it to our attention in order that we could deal with it, he covered it up. When we found out as a leadership team, we removed him and the other deacon from their positions of leadership for obvious reasons. And then we went to meet with the young man who had been bragging about his exploits. This young man happened to be really good friends, him and his family, really good friends of the family that took us out to eat steak and gave us freezer beef. When this family found out that we had removed these two deacons and were meeting with their friend's son, they came to me and they said, "I can't believe that you are standing against us after we took you and your family out for steak and filled your freezer with beef." I stood there in shock. I was confused. I was amazed that anyone would think that what they give provides them with the right to govern, the right to demand their way, the right to be applauded, the right to have a position of leadership inside the kingdom of God, the right to demand that sin and leadership be ignored. Over freezer beef. They thought if you give enough, God and man will be impressed. You can gain control and you can have things done your way if you just give enough. Friends, it wasn't the amount given that Jesus commended. Those who gave large sums did not gain his approval because they gave a lot. It was the heart and the sacrifice of the giver that was commended. And that's what we discover in today's text. What brings approval is the sacrifice and the heart of the giver. See it there in the handout? What brings approval is the sacrifice and the heart of the giver. Look down there in verses 42 and 43 if you would. It says there, "And a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. And he called his disciples to him, and he said to them, 'Truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all these who are contributing to the offering box.'" Wow. A penny, 2 small copper coins, was more than the dozens of coins being tossed in by the rich folks. Wow. She was commended by God come in the flesh, Jesus Christ. No trumpet blast, no purposeful clanging, no prideful boasting, just a sacrificial gift from a humble servant of God. And this woman, she knew that the important thing was the sacrifice and the heart of the giver. Can you imagine what it would have been like to be one of the disciples looking over at that poor widow and hearing the words that Jesus said? She gave more than all of these. What's really amazing is here we are over 2,000 years later, and we're still celebrating her gift. The gift of a humble widow. She sought no recognition. But Jesus himself praised her for her 2 copper coins. I love what Peter had to say. He said, "God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble." How true it is. The next thing we learn in the text is it's not easy to be a sacrificial giver. Man, this woman really cut things close. Let's read verse 44 there. It says, "For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all that she had to live on." This woman didn't throw in her leftovers. This woman threw in all she had. And Jesus let his disciples know that he recognized the difference between sacrificial giving and someone giving out of their excess. I think a lot of improper giving still takes place today. Oh, you said, no, preacher, you're wrong. We give, right? Oh, let's think about this for a minute. I'm convinced that some folks look into their purse or their billfold on Sunday morning, and they dig around to find the smallest denomination bill that they have. And once they find it, when the offering plate goes by, they drop it in because they don't want to be seen as someone who doesn't give. Now, tell me that never happens. I know it does because sometimes I've done it myself at men's meetings. Really? I mean, seriously. I've done it myself, and I'm thinking maybe if the preacher did it, some other people might have done it too. You dig through, find the smallest one, and put it in because the offering plate's going by, and you feel kind of guilty if it goes by and you don't put something in. Some other people, they do it differently. They dig into their billfold or their purse, and they find a big old $100 bill. And then they open it up nice and flat, fold it a couple times to make sure it lays out there. And when the plate goes by, they hold it up and lay it right down there for everybody to see. Is any of those in there? Get myself in trouble this morning. They want everybody to see that they gave a $100 bill. Friends, don't fool yourself. You're not impressing God. Because God knows the heart of the giver. God knows the circumstances of the giver. He knows if you're giving with joy or if you're giving begrudgingly. He knows that. He knows if you're trying to impress your neighbor, and he knows if you're giving because it's just some extra you really didn't need anyway, or if you're like that widow sacrificing just about everything you got. He knows when you're making a true sacrifice. And the neat thing is, if you're giving sacrificially, God is pleased with even the smallest of gifts. Isn't that wonderful? You don't have to have a $100 bill to be able to give and be noticed by God. Because if you're giving with the right heart and you're giving sacrificially, God knows it. That also means you don't have to feel bad if you have a week when you can't give the amount that you'd like to. We have those weeks sometimes. Oh, preacher, you're telling us not to give. No, I'm saying that God understands we have bad weeks sometimes. God knows your situation in life. He knows the bills that you have. He knows what's broken. He knows what your kids need. But we need to realize there's a huge difference between having a bad week and robbing God. Malachi makes it clear that God wants us to be faithful in our giving. Now the Israelites, they weren't being faithful in their giving, and as a result of not being faithful in their giving, God says, point blank, you're robbing me. He understood the situation of people. He accepts the smallest of gifts, but he doesn't expect us to use that as an excuse to just not give. When you bring your offerings to God, when we bring our offerings to God, it should be an act of worship. If we give to God, he promises blessings for us. Now, don't get me all wrong. I'm not talking about the kind of blessings the TV preachers are telling you about. It doesn't say any place in Scripture that if you give $10, God's going to give you $100. Doesn't work that way. What we are told is that God will bless the work of your hands. He will protect us from many of the things that destroy the fruit of our labors. I have to wonder how many times I've been driving down the road and there's been a screw or a nail or a piece of metal or something else in the road that I very well could have ran over, but I missed because God's watching over me. I have to wonder how many times an appliance or a vehicle, we drive out so they got 200 and some thousand miles on them and they still go by God's grace. I wonder how many times our vehicles go or our appliances go longer than ever expected. It's kind of like the clothing of the Israelites in the wilderness. They wore them and they wore them and they never wore out. I wonder how many times things have lasted longer than they should have because God knew we were giving sacrificially and took care of us. I wonder how many of the scholarships our kids got that they wouldn't have gotten had we not been giving appropriately. You see, It's not a get-rich scheme. This is a promise from a loving Father. Malachi says this. He says, you test me in this. You give sacrificially with the right heart, and you watch me bless you. Did you know that? You watch me bless you. You can find that for yourself. Malachi chapter 3, verses 8 to 12, if you want to look it up when you get home. He has a whole story in there about people robbing God and how much he'll bless them if they straighten up and start living and giving like they're supposed to. Here's what I'd like for us to do this next week. This is the action plan, if you will. Before we meet again next week, I'd like for all of us to examine the blessings that we've been given. And then to make a conscious choice about giving before we come to worship next week. Be aware, things are not always as they seem. Small offerings might be really big in God's eyes. Big offerings might be really small in God's eyes. God knows our heart and he knows our sacrifice. We simply can't fool God. So let's give sacrificially out of a heart of love next week. Let's truly surrender everything to God. Not what's the smallest thing I can get by with, or what's the biggest thing I can be seen doing, but what's my heart telling me to do as a result of the blessings God has bestowed upon me. And then let's watch as God throws open the floodgates of heaven. Are you ready to surrender everything to God? That's what we're asking you to do this morning. Surrender it all to God and come back ready to give next week. If you're ready to make that kind of dedication, our dedication song this morning is I Surrender All. Do you? Are you willing to? You've been listening to a message presented by Dr. Gary Snowden, minister at Newmarket Christian Church. We would love to have you come join us as we seek to worship God, love one another, and reach out to our neighbors.